Buildings remember things people forget. Carousels remember in vibration. In the faint tremor a hand-carved horse sends up to its pole with every turn, felt by almost nobody, forgotten by almost everybody. Elias Kimber had spent 23 years learning to feel that tremor inside Ferris Point Amusement Park, home to a hand-carved 1924 carousel, still in daily operation during the park season. Its original center pole and rotating platform mechanism preserved beneath decades of motor upgrades and safety modernizations layered around the historic core. He was 58 now, ride mechanic and carousel restorer, responsible for the rotating mechanism, the hand-carved wooden horses, and the precise up-and-down galloping motion each horse made as it rode its individual pole around the platform. He had learned to feel that tremor from a man named Otis Van Dorn, who had kept the carousel running for 26 years before him and who believed, without needing to argue the point, that a hand-built machine from 1924 spoke through vibration, and a mechanic who couldn't feel the difference between horses had no business maintaining them. Elias started at Ferris Point at 35, hired as Van Dorn's assistant during a season when the park was debating whether the aging carousel was worth the upkeep at all, given how easily a modern ride could draw the same crowds without any of the antique fuss. Van Dorn was 61 then, broad-handed and unhurried, a man who could rest his palm against a spinning pole and tell you which horse's bearing needed attention before any gauge confirmed it. This ride was carved by hand, Van Dorn told him. During Elias's first week, the two of them standing at the platform's edge while the carousel spun its slow, gentle circle in the afternoon light. Every horse on here has its own weight, its own balance, its own way of moving to the gallop. A machine built by hand doesn't fail the way a machine built by robots fails. It tells you something's wrong the same way an old friend tells you something's wrong. Quietly, and only if you're paying attention. Van Dorn kept ride smoothness logs, subjective but consistent notes on which horses rode smoothly and which rode rough, recorded not because the park acquired it, but because he believed a hand-built machine deserved somebody listening to it the way you'd listen to a person. Elias remembered the first time Van Dorn made him walk the platform during a slow test rotation, resting a bare hand against each pole in turn, describing out loud what he felt at every position. He'd asked, honestly skeptical, whether any of this could really be more reliable than a proper diagnostic tool. Van Dorn had kept his hand against the pole a moment longer before answering, unhurried as always. A tool tells you what it's built to measure, he'd said. Your hand tells you what's actually there. This ride was carved before anybody thought to build a tool for it. The least we can do is keep listening to it the same way the men who built it would have. When Van Dorn retired, he left Elias the logs, along with a piece of advice Elias had carried for 23 years since. Put your hand on the pole while it turns. If it feels different from its neighbors, don't argue with your hand. It knows things a wrench doesn't. Ferris Point's carousel had been carved in 1924 by craftsmen whose names were mostly lost to time. 48 horses arranged in 4 concentric rows around a central rotating platform, each horse riding its own vertical pole through a geared mechanism that produced the galloping rise and fall motion riders had loved for a century. The platform itself sat on a wooden support ring original to the ride's construction, reinforced and resurfaced over the decades but never fully replaced, the historic core preserved beneath layer after layer of safety modernization. Elias knew the carousel the way he knew his own hands. He knew which horse's saddle paint had faded fastest under decades of Ferris Point summer sun, and which gearing beneath the platform needed grease before the season's opening weekend. He knew the particular creak the platform's wooden support ring made settling into its rotation each morning, a sound so familiar he could tell, without looking, whether the ride was running true. And he knew, better than anyone alive, that horse 17 on the outer row had always ridden noticeably rougher than any comparable horse on the ride. It wasn't dramatic. Riders climbing onto horse 17 for a 2-minute spin never consciously registered anything wrong. Parents lifting children into the saddle. Teenagers grinning through their 3rd ride of the day. None of them ever noticed a faint but persistent vibration traveling up to the horse's pole and into its platform mounting. One young father, waiting his turn at the fence one summer afternoon, had once asked Elias why he always seemed to linger near that particular horse a moment longer than the others before waving the ride operator to start. Elias had simply smiled and said it was an old habit, which was true enough without being the whole truth. But Van Dorn had noticed it decades earlier, the moment he rested a hand against that specific pole during rotation, and Elias had learned to notice it the same way. Van Dorn's earliest entry about it, dated 1982, read, Asterisk horse 17 riding rough again. Gearing checked, pole bushings replaced, platform bearing at that position tested sound. Vibration persists regardless. Something under that section of platform doesn't turn as smoothly as the rest of the ride. Watching it, asterisk. Elias had read that entry during his first winter with the logs, sitting in the small maintenance shed behind the Carousel's outer fence, and it felt something settle into place that he wouldn't fully understand for years. Van Dorn had noticed something real. Van Dorn had never solved it, and Van Dorn had kept feeling for it anyway. Season after season, patient enough to preserve a pattern, he never. Elias continued the practice without ever being asked to. Every morning before opening, he'd rest a hand against horse 17's pole during the mechanism's slow test rotation, feeling for the same faint tremor Van Dorn had first noticed. And it was always there, subtle and constant, exactly where Van Dorn said it would be. In his 10th year with the logs, Elias began doing something Van Dorn's subjective notes had never included, measuring the vibration with a simple handheld sensor pressed against the pole housing rather than relying entirely on feel. It took him nearly a decade of those readings to see what Van Dorn's descriptive entries could only suggest. The vibration wasn't holding steady. It was intensifying, a small, measurable increase each year, slowly enough that any single season's readings looked unremarkable, unmistakable once laid out across 10 years of careful sensor figures. Every mechanical component at that position, the gearing, the bushings, the platform bearing, still tested individually sound, exactly as Van Dorn's notes had described decades earlier. And still, year after year, horse 17 rode a little rougher than it had the year before. He sat with that realization one evening in the maintenance shed. Van Dorn's oldest log opened beside his own decade of sensor readings, the carousel silent and dark beyond the shed's window after closing. 2 men, 1 horse. Over 30 years of the same patient question, neither of them ever quite ready to call it solved, and neither of them ever willing to stop feeling for it either. If the intensified vibration had been building since Van Dorn's first 1982 entry, something beneath that one section platform had been quietly, patiently changing for over 40 years, hidden entirely from anyone who only checked whether the individual mechanical parts still worked. He thought about every child who had ever climbed onto horse 17 without knowing that the ride carrying them in a slow, gentle circle was quietly telling 2 mechanics, across 2 careers, that something underneath it had never quite matched the rest of the ride. Decades of birthday parties and summer afternoons, all of them circling gently above a small, patient disagreement in what nobody riding above it had ever been meant to feel. He wrote a new entry beneath Van Dorn's oldest one. In the same plain hand, asterisk 10 years of sensor readings confirm horse 17's vibration is not stable. It is intensifying, slowly, consistently. Every component tests individually sound, 'cause still unknown. Continuing to measure, asterisk. He underlined continuing. It felt like the only honest word available to him. Elias had a theory, in his 14th year, that the cause might simply be uneven wear in the horse's own carved wooden body, a century of riders climbing on and off, decades of paint and varnish layered over the original 1924 carving, potentially shifting the horse's balance just enough to explain a persistent vibration that had nothing to do with the platform at all. He spent the better part of a winter carefully rebalancing horse 17 itself, removing it from its pole, checking its weight distribution against a reference horse from an adjacent position, adjusting where he could without damaging the historic carving, confident he had finally found something a careful craftsman's hand could correct. The vibration returned within the first week of the new season, at almost exactly the intensity his 10-year trend predicted. The horse's own rebalancing had made no measurable difference. Whatever was causing the tremor wasn't the horse itself. It was something happening beneath it, in the platform the horse's pole was mounted to. He had been wrong. He wrote it plainly in the log, in the same unembellished style Van Dorn had taught him without ever meaning to teach a lesson. Astor's horse rebalancing theory. Ruled out. Full rebalance completed. Vibration returned on schedule at predicted intensity. The cause is not the horse. It is in the platform beneath it. Back to unexplained, Asterisk. It bothered him more than most of his wrong guesses did. He had wanted the horse itself to be the answer, something he could fix with his own hands, a winter's careful craft and a closed question. Being wrong meant the cause lived somewhere inside the platform's original 1924 wooden support ring, a section of the ride's oldest structure nobody had opened in decades. The full mechanism restoration announcement arrived in his 19th year. The park approved a comprehensive rebuild of the Carousel's aging drive gearing and rotating platform support structure, restoring every position uniformly according to the Carousel's original 1924 mechanical drawings. The project celebrated the ride's historic character even as it modernized its bones, treating every section of the platform support ring as structurally identical to its neighbors. Elias read the restoration brief and felt an old unease sharpen. If something beneath Horse 17's position had been quietly intensifying for over 40 years, rebuilding that section exactly as designed, according to drawings that had never accounted for whatever was actually happening there, would simply restore the same unexplained problem in brand-new components. He brought Van Dorn's logs, along with his own decade of sensor readings, to the restoration specialist overseeing the mechanism rebuild. The specialist, a capable and straightforward woman named Odalise Ferran, inspected the platform's structural framing at Horse 17's position and found it dimensionally identical to every comparable position on the ride, matching the original 1924 drawings precisely. Every measurement here matches the historic specification exactly, Ferran said, reviewing her survey at a small folding table set up beside the Carousel's outer fence. If there were a real structural difference, I'd expect it to show up in the dimensions, and it doesn't. My honest read is a minor, harmless quirk of the platform's century-old construction, nothing the new gearing and rebuilt bearing system won't simply override regardless of its source. The vibration isn't staying the same, Elias said. I've measured it for 10 years. It's getting stronger every single year, even though every component at that position tests individually sound and matches every other position dimensionally. A harmless with quirk doesn't intensify on a schedule. Something under that platform is still actively changing. Ferran considered that, and to her credit, didn't dismiss it outright. I don't have another explanation for a trend like that, but a dimensional survey that matches the original specification exactly doesn't give me grounds to treat one position differently in a uniform restoration. The project scope is rebuilding to the historic drawings, not an open-ended investigation into a century-old support ring. It was a reasonable position, and Elias didn't have an engineering credential to argue against it. What he had was over 40 years of vibration that had outlasted a full horse rebalancing, and a growing conviction that a dimensional match to the drawings wasn't the same as confirming the actual would still behave the way the drawings assumed it would. Elias didn't sleep well through the weeks that followed. He kept circling back to a question he couldn't put down. What if Ferran was right, and 40 years of feeling for a tremor amounted to nothing more than an old ride's harmless quirk, a pattern he and Van Dorn, between them, had slowly turned into a mystery through nothing but 2 careers of stubborn attention to something that never truly mattered? He had wanted for years for the intensifying vibration to mean something real. Wanting it to matter wasn't the same as it actually he requested at his own initiative. A single day with a wood structure specialist before the platform rebuild reached Horse 17 section. Not to delay the restoration, he made clear, I want to understand what was actually happening inside the century-old support ring before new components locked whatever was doing into place for another generation. The specialist was a woman named Priya Anand, who assessed historic wooden structures for hidden material inconsistencies. She reviewed whatever original construction records the park still possessed alongside Elias's decade of vibration data, and she brought a moisture meter and a small borescope to examine the exposed support ring at Horse 17's position once the platform surface was open during the restoration's early phase. What she found explained over 40 years of vibration that nobody had ever been able to name. This section of the ring was patched at some point, probably early in the ride's life, Priya said, showing Elias the borescope footage at a table set up near the platform's edge. The wood here is a different species than the rest of the ring. Denser, a practical substitution somebody made during an early repair, never noted in any surviving drawing, because at the time it probably seemed like a minor, inconsequential fix. But that denser wood expands and contracts at a different rate than the wood around it, through nearly 100 years of seasonal humidity cycling. That differential movement produces a persistent, slowly worsening irregularity in the platform's rotation right at this one position, the vibration you and Van Dorn both felt through the pole. And the new gearing, Elias said, precisely machined components installed onto a support structure that's still quietly working against its own uniformity, Priya said. You'd risk concentrating new where at exactly this position all over again, just with modern parts wearing under the same old irregularity. Priya's findings went to the restoration committee within the week. Odalise Ferran reviewed the borescope footage and moisture readings personally and called Elias afterward. You were right to push for this, Ferran said. The dimensional survey told the truth about every measurement it checked. It just never occurred to anyone that a century-old with substitution might still be quietly moving beneath a specification that assumed uniform material throughout. If we'd rebuilt this position exactly as drawn, we'd have installed brand new gearing onto the same irregularity, and probably spent years chasing premature, where at Horse 17's position all over again. The restoration plan was revised. The mismatched section support ring was carefully stabilized and, where necessary, reinforced to compensate for its differential movement before any new gearing was installed. The rest of the platform rebuild proceeded afterward, restoring the Carousel's historic character on a support structure that finally accounted for what a century of humidity cycling had actually done to it. Ferris Point filed a formal note in its facilities archive, crediting both Otis Van Dorn's original 1982 observation and Elias's 23 years of continued measurement as the reason a hidden century-old material inconsistency had been found and properly addressed before uniform restoration repeated the same slow deterioration in brand new components. Elias kept Van Dorn's logs. He added a final entry beneath the oldest one before moving the whole collection into the park's permanent archive. Asterisk support ring beneath Horse 17 stabilized and reinforced this year, with mismatch traced to an early, undocumented repair, documented informally through vibration since 1982. First season on record with no measurable vibration at that position. Otis, you were right. A hand-built machine speaks through vibration, and this one had been speaking since before either of us was ever hired to listen. Neither of us knew what it was saying for a very long time. Asterisk. He rested his palm against Horse 17's pole during the mechanism's first test rotation of the new season, feeling nothing but the same smooth, steady turn every other horse on the ride produced for the first time in the Carousel's recorded history. He thought about Van Dorn, standing at the same platform edge decades earlier, telling a nervous new hire that a hand-built machine tells you something's wrong quietly, the way an old friend does, and only if you're paying attention. Elias had carried that sentence through 23 years, through a ruled-out rebalancing theory, through a season of real doubt about whether 2 careers of careful listening had amounted to anything more than sentiment mistaken for evidence. He hadn't needed to understand the cause immediately.